Well, we have a special guest today for Deer Talk Now, a guest that we've had before, and a man that I admire greatly, Dr. Stephen Ditchkoff from Auburn University. Steve, thanks for joining us today for Deer Talk Now.
Hey, good morning, Dan. I appreciate being here. Love doing this with you guys. Love your show, and just it's an honor to be here.
Awesome, thank you. If in case you guys don't know, we have a lot of this stuff on our website, and also if you go to social Facebook, you can find the Deer Lab at Auburn University. Some of the brightest young minds in deer research come from this program, and Steve heads it up. You've been doing this for how long now, Steve, with the Deer Lab?
So this is my 24th year at Auburn University. So we've been doing deer research I've been doing deer research at Auburn for 24 years, but my research history goes back probably, I guess, over 30 years now. I'm starting to age myself, starting to see the end of the light at the end of the tunnel. But we've had our captive deer research facility since 2007, and we're more than knee deep in it. I've been doing it for a long time.
What did now I should know this and I don't remember. What did you do before you got to Auburn?
So just before I got to Auburn, I did my PhD at Oklahoma State. That's where my dissertation research was focused on studying antlers and whether or not they're honest signals of quality. Is it large antlered male? Is that individual a high quality male from a breeding perspective, that sort of thing. Prior to that, I was at University of Maine, where I studied the wintering ecology of deer, kind of from a nutritional physiological perspective. And prior to that, I did my undergraduate at Michigan State.
It's pretty awesome, and I don't know if I shared this with you before, but John Ozoga, our longtime research editor.
Yep.
John's from Michigan. He worked with the Michigan DNR for over 30 years. But this is about the time that I became editor-in-chief, which was 2001. We were doing some things, and I would talk with John. John's retired now, but I would talk to John regularly, and he would always refer to you as your last name, Ditchkoff. And he goes, I don't know who this Ditchkoff is, but he's doing some great work, and he would, as you know, he would cite your research that you were doing back then. This was before you got to Auburn. And I can't remember when it was, but it was later, years, if not a decade later. I said, Steve's from Michigan, don't you? And he's like, well, you've talked to John. He kind of got that little bit of gruff. He goes, well, I didn't know that, and he just like, I've just been following all the things that you wrote. But I thought that was kind of an interesting note that you both started in the same area.
Well, it's the ultimate compliment. I think I've said it here. We talk about it with my colleagues and my peers across the country. We talk about it, with my students. John was involved in research back I think he was starting in the 60s, but in the 70s and the 80s, Michigan DNR was doing just cutting edge research, and he and his colleagues there at the casino enclosure in northern Michigan, they were doing research that was decades ahead of its time.
Way ahead of its time.
And as a master's student and a PhD student, I remember citing Ozaga papers, and I knew that name. I knew where that research was. I was familiar with that enclosure, at least on paper, what they had been doing. And I was always just so impressed with what they had done. And today it's 2024, and we're citing 1984 papers and 1988 papers, and nobody is taking the next step from what the work they had done. And so I've always just held John in such high regard for the work that he did, to understand white-tailed deer reproductive patterns and nutritional patterns. And it's still so relevant today, and we're still leaning on the work that they did. And so for him to say, to have a compliment about me or the work that I've done, it's the highest compliment.
It's awesome. And you are right. They were decades, if not more, ahead of their time. We could go off a rabbit hole. I won't. But I remember John telling me
research facility.
Yes. Yeah, that research facility was.
Our research facility.
I'm sorry?
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Our deer research facility was modeled after theirs.
It was.
They had the only one like anything in the world. And so when we constructed ours in 2007, there's differences, but it was designed with the same thought to be able to follow a population through time and individuals through time. These ideas that they had, they weren't a decade or 2 decades. They were 40, 50 years ahead of their time. It's just amazing.
Well, let's talk about that for a minute because, as most of us know, uh, Cusino was closed. I don't know how many years ago, and that was funded by the state. Auburn is a university; it's funded differently. You don't see this stuff coming from states too much anymore. So has that shifted now that if we're looking for good deer research, we're going to be looking towards the university systems?
It depends. I think the majority of the research that's coming out that we would lean upon, in most cases from a white-tailed deer perspective, is coming out of universities. Most state agencies lean on the university as their research arm. The agencies are designed to have their boots in the dirt and manage these species and identify issues. And the universities tend to be, at least today, excuse me, I can't speak for the 70s or 80s so much, but today the universities are generally far better tooled to address those research questions. So in most states, the university or the land grant university is a very strong partnership with the state agency. So the Michigan DNR is going to have a very strong partnership with Michigan State, being the land grant university, and Ohio State with the Ohio State Agency. And so but the Michigan DNR, from everything that we were taught back when I was in school, was ahead of its time in many ways. And they deserve a lot of credit back then. But my guess is there was also a decision made that said it's a wise investment for us to lean on the expertise of the university rather than duplicating that expertise and bringing that in house. You see a lot of corporations that say, you know what, we're going to contract out our janitorial services or our security or whatever it is. And I think that's probably the mindset: is let's put our resources towards something else and let's lean on the university as our research partner.
Do you think? I don't want to go off on a tangent here, but do you think that's a good idea? Are the universities, as a whole, looking out for the research, or looking out for the resource on the same level as the state would be?
No, I don't think they're looking out for the resource on the same level. But it's my part and my role in this is not to identify what the research questions are. It's the state's role to identify what are their issues and what are their research questions, and then to work with the researcher to say we need to answer question A, question B, and question C, to work together to say, and then it's my job to say, okay, this is how I think is the best way to answer those questions, and are we in agreement? We agreement on the approach? Are we in agreement on the budget? And then implement that research. The problem lies in sometimes those questions have already been addressed. And so, for example, if I work in Alabama, if the state of Alabama is interested in survival of white-tailed deer, there has been 100 survival studies published. There are not specific data for Alabama necessarily, and so that question is very relevant to the state of Alabama and to the agency for them to model their population. But for me, where the metric by which I'm measured is getting peer-reviewed publications or journal articles published, when I try and publish this is the survival rate of white-tailed deer in Alabama, it's more difficult to get it published because it's already been addressed in Tennessee and South Carolina and Georgia and Mississippi. And so I need to we are always trying to come up with creative ways and new angles to look at the data. It's my job to say, how do I address question A, B, and C for the state? Yet when I'm working with a master's student or a PhD student, say, how do we use those same data and those same efforts to come up with a unique question to address to advance science? Not just for the state of Alabama, but for white-tailed biology as a whole. And that's where sometimes there's, it's like two trains meeting in the night that just kind of pass on the tracks. Those university faculty that are good at what they do are able to meet the state's goals, but also address the needs of science. and push science forward with the same effort.
That's very interesting. How do you think, personally, Steve's opinion, not the University of Auburn's opinion, I'm going to make that clarification probably a lot today. How are states today doing in modeling their populations? And what I mean by that is estimating their populations and managing their populations.
I think overall, I would say in most cases states are doing very well. But we have to understand that I think most of these populations, when we're talking about game populations, deer populations, as opposed to maybe endangered species or something like that, these wildlife populations are very resilient. So this is going to sound bad. I'm going to say I think that if there's mistakes made, I think they're easily overcome. And none of us are perfect, so there's always going to be mistakes made. But I think the challenges is understanding how do we meet the needs of all the stakeholders in a constantly evolving environment where 40 years ago we, pre-internet, pre-cable television, we were managing white-tailed deer for hunters and agricultural producers that were conflicting, competing interests. But it was very simple. Today, with the internet and all and animal rights groups and the political environments in which we live, these state agencies it's really challenging for them. How do you meet, because everybody's an expert, everybody has access to all the information, and everybody has a voice now. And that's a wonderful thing, but it's a very challenging thing for these state agencies. And I think in some way, there's a little bit of playing catch up. And we all are in all of our fields. But I think I would not want to be in their shoes trying to understand what are the interests of my stakeholders, my hunters being my number one stakeholder, probably my agricultural producers being my second stakeholder, my drivers being my third stakeholder, but having these other groups that just have a voice and are very vocal and can create a political firestorm if the wrong thing happens. I think it's a very challenging environment. So when you ask who is doing well and who is not, I think it's a function of the personalities and the individuals that are in leadership positions in these agencies and their ability to adapt and work with the challenges of 2024 as opposed to the challenges of 2018, because it's changing rapidly. It's really changing rapidly, and I would not want to be in their shoes. It's hard.
I got to get somebody from that side on the program, because I would ask them from what you just said, because that was the question running through my mind. Okay, who are the stakeholders? All right, let's talk about hunters, agriculture producers, and drivers. Those three. Do the others even matter? And should, of course, the squeaky wheel is always the one being heard, but let's face it. Who's bringing you to the party? Hunters, important, not just from a economic impact, but from a wildlife management impact. The number one person on the list for managing wildlife. Agriculture producers, yes, very important. They're feeding the country. We can't have 100 deer per square mile eating their crops. And drivers, we don't want people getting killed hitting cars. But then when you get past those three, okay, you do have to do a balance. I guess that's a rhetorical question. Deer Talk Now is brought to you by Wildlife Research Center and the new Golden Rope Scent Rope Kit. The kit comes with 4 ounces of Golden Rope Scent Concentrate, 3 cable ties, and 3 scent ropes made of proprietary fibers meant to absorb the maximum amount of scent. Simply saturate the rope in your scent of choice, hang it from a branch, and watch the trail cam photos come flying in. For more information, go to wildlife.com. Okay, so what I want to do now, Steve, is I have a list of about a dozen. I don't know if we're going to get to all these. These are some things that I actually pulled off from some of you faithful listeners and viewers. So you can send questions to us on Instagram, Facebook, our website, wherever you're listening to the podcast. Just drop a comment. And Ian, our crack producer, he is keeping track of these. I am too. We put them in a big hopper. And here are some of the questions for you, Steve. Number one, I know you guys have done a lot of work, and you have particularly done a lot of work, research on summer range for whitetails. We're in summer right now as we're recording this podcast. What is the key to good summer range for white-tailed deer?
I would think that there's two keys. Is at the end of the day, it's going to be forage quality, and how do you get forage quality, and what is forage quality? It's the growing season. It's the time of greatest nutrient demand for these critters. You have fawns being born across most of their range in the first week of June. You have lactation occurring, and you have antler development occurring. These are extremely demanding processes from a nutrient perspective, and so to have good habitat, you have to have high forage availability and high quality stuff. To start, we got to keep in mind that a white-tailed deer feeds between 0 and 6 feet. So that vegetation has to be between 0 and 6 feet. They're not reaching any higher, and generally, most deer aren't reaching up to 6 feet even. So to get forage at that level, we have to have sunlight hitting the ground. The beautiful mature oak forests, as deer hunters, we love them. We think of them as amazing habitat. But if you walk through these, there's not a lot growing on the ground. They're wonderful for a month when the acorns are coming down, but the other 11 months and the most critical period, May, June, July, August, and if you talk about Alabama, August, September, they're very poor habitat. And so I think, as a deer hunter, as a land manager, you have to think, how do I get good quality vegetation on the ground? And it starts with sunlight. There's a lot of different ways to do it, whether it be timber harvest, whether it be selective thinning, whether it be use of herbicides, whether it be disking to set back succession, or bush hogging. There's a lot of different ways to do that. Number two is, I think we need to understand what the nutrients are that we're talking about. And when we're talking about forage quality for deer and most terrestrial species, we're talking about protein. Protein is the most limiting nutrient for wildlife, for herbivorous wildlife species. I think most of us are familiar with fertilizer. We go take a look at a bag, NPK, those are the three numbers that are on there. N, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. Nitrogen is the limiting nutrient for protein, or the limiting mineral for protein. So, and when we go buy a bag of fertilizer, its nitrogen is what's most expensive. That is the most limiting nutrient in terrestrial ecosystems for plants. Ultimately, and nitrogen is the inorganic form. Protein is the organic form that the animals are using. So we got to figure out how to get nitrogen there, or get plants that are actually pulling nitrogen out of the soil or out of the air to be able to put it into organic form, which is protein. So what we are trying to do is get sunlight on the ground, get vegetation between 0 and 6 feet, and maximize the protein availability of our landscape. To me, that's the biggest thing. How you do that depends upon where you are, depends upon what your soil types are, depends upon the time of the year. But that's the biggest thing right there.
And that would be a combination, that's a great answer, a combination of, some guys just think simply, I'm going to plant a food plot. Well, that helps. But you got to be looking at the macro view of what you have going on there. And I know you have done also, we saw it when we were down there visiting you a couple of years ago. You've done it a lot in the South with prescribed burning, and that is helping a lot, is it not?
It is, because what prescribed burning is doing is it's reducing understory. It's getting rid of maybe a brushy layer that's between 6 and 8 and 10 and 12 feet, and it's getting rid of that brushy layer so that sunlight, because you can have sunlight, being cut off at 100 feet in a tree canopy, but you also have sunlight being cut off at 15 feet or 10 feet in elevation. And so prescribed fire is really designed to eliminate that brushy level and get it back down to an herbaceous level. If we think about this with other species, what areas of the world do we have the greatest density of animals? And it's the plains. Think about Africa. Think about those grasslands where you just have mass quantities of herbaceous vegetation on the ground. The sheer volume of animals. Think about 250,000 head of caribou in one herd. It's supported by a grass ecosystem. Think about the bison. It's the same way. It's now we're not talking. Now, grass is not a good forage for deer, but all of those other things that are coming up between the grasses are high quality forage. Those different weeds, those different forbs. And so anything that we can do to get sunlight on the ground and get herbaceous vegetation as opposed to woody vegetation. Woody vegetation can be good, and leaves can be high quality when they're in their early stages, but their quality decreases as they become a little more fibrous. Those individual leaves age. And so getting sunlight on the ground, keeping these areas in an early successional state, really increases the quality of the habitat, and it increases the quantity of protein available. Protein is what fuels productive processes: growth of body, growth of antlers, growth of fetus. Other productive process is lactation. Lactation is the most nutritionally costly activity that any mammalian species experiences, other than maybe migration. Migration is an energetic thing, it's not a productive. From a productive process, lactation is far more costly to that female than antler growth, than body growth, than anything else. And the survival and success of those fawns in the short term and the long term is going to be a function of how much milk can that mother produce. So anything that can be done to get sunlight on the ground, keep it in an early successional state, and those deer will go out and find the high quality plants if you can make them available.
How good is fire at? I know it suppresses invasives, but how good is it at getting? I don't want to say eliminating invasives, but getting it back to a more natural environment.
Well, I mean, there are some invasive species that do very well with fire. So it just depends. There's an example, Kogan grass down here in the south, which is just a horrible invasive species, just thrives with fire. So it just depends.
So it's not a cure-all. It's not a cure-all. We're gonna burn this and it's gonna be awesome. It's gonna be an ongoing process.
It's not a cure-all. I think, when I look at fire, and most of my colleagues look at fire, we are taught that, every ecosystem, every habitat is a fire-based habitat. It's just a function of how frequently it comes through. The longleaf pine ecosystem here in the southeast is generally a 2 to 3 to 4 year rotation. It used to burn naturally to every probably 3 to 4 years. Other habitats, if you go out, we hear about wildfires in California and places like that. And so you think that is not a fire-based ecosystem. It is a fire-based ecosystem, just at a certain frequency. It might be 50 years. It might be 100 years. Everything, we have all these wildfires up in Canada. This has to happen. They need to burn. It's part of the natural cycle of things. It's just a function of the frequency with which it burns. And there's some plants that don't do well with the fire. Some plants do well with the fire. You go back and take a look at Yellowstone. Yellowstone was just torched. It was at the 80s or the 90s. And everybody said, oh my goodness, we've just destroyed this park. And for the short term, it probably wasn't the most beautiful thing to look at. But if you drive and take a look at Yellowstone today, there's not going to be a person that's going to come out and isn't going to say, wow, this is beautiful. It's fire sets back succession and just kind of gives it a reset, that habitat to some degree. And and really good things happen. Now, the one thing I'm going to say is, it doesn't mean you need to go out and drop a match and start burning ecosystems. You need to understand where you are, what the rules are. There's a lot of liability associated with it, and you can do a lot of harm to habitat, by burning, at the wrong time or even burning. It's understanding what it is, and fire can be a good thing anywhere.
That's a great point, and I will add on to that. A lot of people want that shortcut, and obviously you have to really educate yourself, not just on what it does, but on how to do it, and then go through the state regulations and processes and local processes. And I would say the same thing with any type of I see guys hinge cutting. They see a thing saying, oh, hinge cutting is great, and they just whip out their chainsaw and they start cutting down trees. please educate yourself on that. And I'd say I can guarantee you're one or two friends away in your circle from knowing a logger. So if you're going to do it that way, talk to somebody who actually knows how to do that stuff. Steve, you talk about lactation, which is super important for summer range. I know you guys have done some studies, and I believe one of your students just presented a paper on this recently, but let's talk a little bit about what you know about white-tailed does, which ones are the best mothers, and how does that unfold as we start getting into June, July, and August?
It's yeah, my graduate student Tristan Swartout, when he for his master's work, and he's continuing on for a PhD with me, but he did some very interesting research examining the successive mothers. What defines a good doe? What defines a doe that's a good mother? And we learned from John Ozaga's work, some of the things that defined a good mother. It's larger does tend to produce more milk. Well, that's a good mother. Larger does tend to be more dominant. They're going to be able to acquire resources for their offspring. That's a good mother. We tend to think that older does are more experienced, so they're going to be good mothers. These are all some of the things that are logical thought processes and kind of the ways we think. But we had some capabilities that John and his, colleagues didn't necessarily have in the 80s. And so we decided to kind of circle back and look at this again to see if we could replicate John's research and see if we could learn anything new. And so we had data going back from 2007. I think we ran this data through like 2019. So we had about 12, 13 years of consecutive years of data from our Deer Research Facility, where we know the mother and father of every fawn that is born and recruited into the adult age class. So we can go through and determine, okay, this was the, fawn 106 was born to doe 807. And so we started looking at this, expecting to see that body size and age and all of these things were very important, and they are important. But what we found to be really interesting was they weren't the most important thing, and we can't necessarily put our finger on what is the most important thing. But what we did find is that there are some mothers that are just good, and there's some mothers that are just poor. And so there's something else going on there. Is it the intelligence of the mother to say, I need to feed my fawn more frequently? Is it that I need to take my fawn to an area that's a better bedding and hiding cover? Is it, there's something else going on? Is it just the genetics that I'm passing on to my offspring that's more important than my size and my ability to produce milk? And so what we noticed was there were mothers that successfully recruit, not just produce a fawn, but successfully recruited into the adult age class, that they would, if they had a fawn one year, they had a greater probability of successfully recruiting a fawn the next year than those does that did not. Other research with caribou species and some others have indicated that if you successfully recruit your calf as a caribou, you've invested so much energy into that offspring from a lactation perspective that it makes it harder on you to successfully recruit the next year. So that's what we had predicted going in. Those caribou cows that lose their calf early to predation are able, don't utilize as many reserves, go through winter in better condition, and are in a better position to successfully recruit a calf the next year. We had thought the same thing was going to be true, and we found the opposite. We found that good mothers tend to continue to successfully recruit, whereas poor mothers may never successfully recruit an offspring. I think the number was 40% of our does successfully recruited like 85% of our fawns. And don't quote me on those numbers. I don't have them. It was a pretty impressive number.
Wow. And so did experience matter? Or it was just the success? So it wasn't necessarily having fawns. It was the success of getting that fawn to recruit.
We didn't really find that experience was more important. It was I don't know if it's something that's just innate. They're more intelligent, or they're making the right choices. Whatever it is, it was more just like you're a good mother or you're a poor mother.
Wow.
Maybe it's as simple as there's some of us born a little more compassionate than others. There's, as humans, or some of us just have some innate skills that I'm a little better at X, and Jimmy's a little better at Y. We're not in a position that we can put our finger on what is it, other than to say, if I'm sitting in a tree stand and looking out at a food plot and I'm trying to decide which doe to harvest, most of us will say, don't harvest the doe that has the fawns. We don't want to orphan those fawns, which I believe is a little bit of an archaic philosophy, but I think it depends upon what your management goals are. If I want to keep my high quality does in the population that are successful at recruiting fawns, then no, shoot the doe that does not have fawns. I will remove my poor mothers. I have a greater probability of removing a poor mother. But if I'm in a really high density population, I want to remove my good mothers if I'm trying to reduce my population. And so in theory, you could make some selections that might help you speed up working towards your population goals.
And I think we overthink it a lot. I think guys just get too down in the weeds trying to analyze this. And I think it's as simple as you said. What are your goals? Are your goals to reduce the population, or keep it status quo, and in that case go out and harvest those does if you have to? I think you might disagree with me here. I think as a whole across the country, people are killing too many does. The guys that are doing it their hearts might be in the right place, but they're hunting small properties and they're just pounding deer because the state's giving them tags. And the state, on the other hand, I will give the state some credit. The state's like, listen, we can't micromanage, so we're going to give out X amount of tags. But I think it's on to the individual hunter to decide, what do I want? If I'm not seeing deer, stop killing does. If I'm seeing too many, then go ahead and take some out.
I think there's a couple things at play here. Is number one is, quality deer management really swung into vogue beginning in the 80s and really became the hot topic. This is the way we need to manage deer in the 90s and into the 2000s. And a major component of that was we need to have an adequate harvest of antlerless deer. At the time, in a lot of places, we had very high numbers of deer, and we needed to knock those numbers down. And so, that is still a mindset for many deer hunters. I need to shoot a lot of does, or maybe it's a habit that's become almost a necessity. I need 5 does to fill my freezer. We've gotten used to that, whatever that is. And the reality is, I think there's some places that need that harvest, and there's other places that don't. And I think you brought up a very good point. That I'm in partial agreement with, I'm in partial disagreement with, is the state agencies. They're in a difficult position, and I'm going to give you a classic example of here in southern Alabama. Our deer hunters are claiming, we're not seeing the deer that we need to see, but we have individual producers, that are getting depredation permits that may be eliminating 100 deer each on their properties.
Wow.
And how do you equate these two things? If a producer on 1,000 or 2,000 acres is shooting 100 deer in May and June, how does that not and year after year, how does that not translate into a population that may be a little too high? It is. It definitely is from that perspective. And my goodness, if it's sustained harvest, sustained depredation, sustained reduction in deer numbers, that deer density is very, very high. And so it's not necessarily driving with what we're hearing from hunters. And so is it deer that are moving, and migrating into these areas where we have agricultural production? You have suburban areas that are screaming for relief from these deer. You have agricultural producers that are screaming for relief. And I think if you talk to your insurance companies, their numbers of claims are high. And so there's a lot of metrics that are really saying, and I'm not saying for everywhere, but in a lot of places, the metrics are saying we have a lot of deer, a whole lot of deer. And so as deer hunters, I have to wonder is are we are we a victim of our memory on what we used to think and what we and are our expectations skewed out from where they should be? Are our expectations too high in terms of the number of deer we see? I don't know. I think that and this is, this goes back full circle to what I was talking about before. And I think I should say, I don't know what it's like to walk in the shoes of a state biologist. That's a hard job, and to deal with that public. And I definitely don't know the challenges that they have to deal with, and I couldn't do it. That's not where my skill set is, and they're in a tough position. And I do believe, firmly that they are really trying to do it right. They're handcuffed sometimes from politics, from advisory boards and governor appointees and that sort of thing. But they're trying to do it right. They're passionate about this, and they have pride in terms of it. I know a high percentage of the state deer biologists around the country. These people have pride in what they take pride in what they do, and they are trying to produce a quality product for hunters. And it's not due to a lack of desire or work ethic or anything like that. It's hard. It's hard to meet the desires and expectations of Dan Schmidt at the same time meeting the desires and expectations of Steve Ditchkoff and your agricultural producers. And it's a tough job. It's a
So,
tough
in
job.
that same vein, again, your opinion, Steve's opinion, does the insurance lobby have any control over this as far as
I,
deer populations?
I think they have, I can't speak for every state. I think it's going to vary. But I think they don't have a say. But when you start talking money, money influences things. And I'm not a political guy. I don't know the politics, and they don't let me into those backroom discussions, and it's probably a good thing. But money talks. We all know that. We see it happen in Washington. Money makes things happen. And if you have insurance companies, and if we start, and I don't even know, the hundreds of millions of dollars, the billions of dollars, whatever these costs are in a year, you can't tell me that those companies don't have access to powerful political allies. And is it making a difference? I don't know. I'm not involved in that. But do I think it can have impacts? Yes, I do.
Interesting. That's interesting. Okay, one more question for you, Steve. I'm sorry, we're going to have to save these and have you back. Hopefully, you'll join us again. I know you will. Um, this was interesting, and I think I might. I don't know if I gave you a heads up on this one, but white-tailed deer blood kills the bacteria that causes Lyme disease. So deer are actually not the ones that are transmitting Lyme disease. What do you know about this research? I think it was from University of Massachusetts.
Yeah, I was contacted by some some really smart people from UMass that wanted to understand the role of deer blood and how it related to Borrelia burgdorferi, which is the actual disease agent of Lyme disease. And and then let me just state right up front is, I don't have the intellectual capacity or the background to be able to explain what's going on from a physiological or an immunological perspective. But we worked collaboratively with them to get them some blood from some of our deer, and they did a lot of laboratory work. And what they found was that the active disease causing agent of Lyme disease. Lyme disease is the symptoms, the expression of the symptoms in us, but the actual agent, the Borrelia species, did not survive in the serum. So the deer are not actually carriers of Lyme disease. The deer are a host for a life stage of the tick that actually carries Lyme disease. So you can go handle, I remember when Lyme disease popped up, and you probably remember the same thing. We started talking about, boy, if you cut open the rib cage when you are field dressing a deer, you're creating sharp edges um, on those ribs that you could scratch your arm, and in theory, you could get Lyme disease from the blood of that deer. And what we're finding is no, you're not going to get that. You're going to get it from the ticks. Now, these guys are doing some more research. They have some more blood from some of our deer, trying to understand this better. And this is, who knows where they take this to understand. Number one, deer blood kills Lyme disease, but more importantly, how, why, what can we learn from it that might lead towards ways in which we could reduce issues with humans and pets and that sort of thing.
Fascinating stuff. If you guys are not fascinated in this research, you're listening to the wrong program, because I think this is awesome stuff. Steve, thank you so much. Auburn, the Deer Lab at Auburn University, this is the stuff these guys deal with every day, and they're working on it. Preeminent institution in America. You're doing so much for not only deer hunters, but the general public and wildlife lovers everywhere. Steve, thanks for joining us. I know you're on some field research today, so you took some time out of your schedule to join us. We really appreciate that.
Hey, Dan, listen, I love being on a show, and I'd love to do it more often. Just you let me know when you want to do it, and I'll be here.
Awesome. We're going to do that. For Dr. Steve Ditchkoff, I am Dan Schmidt. Thank you for joining us for Deer Talk Now. All we ask you to do is like or subscribe to this video and our channel or our podcast platform. Whether you're listening to the podcast on your favorite platform or you're watching it on YouTube, Facebook, or Instagram, if you want to check out all the video versions, they're on our YouTube page. It's YouTube.com/DDH Online. And we will catch you again next Thursday for another episode of Deer Talk Now.